But
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for what is, I think, arguably the most profound and challenging intellectual exercise you can imagine.
it really is.
We are tackling the absolute core question of theology. How do we, as finite temporal beings, our very thought processors are structured by physical experience. How do we speak with any kind of integrity about the divine? The boundless, the eternal, the absolute. It forces you to confront the very limits of human language itself.
It does. Our language is fundamentally rooted in the world of composition, of change, time, and space.
Right.
So when we try to apply an adjective like powerful or, knowing to a reality that is completely transcendent, a reality where none of those physical constraints apply, we run a huge risk.
The risk of making God in our own image.
Exactly. And that tension, that constant tension between describing perfection on the one hand and upholding transcendence on the other, that has been the engine of, centuries of theological debate.
And that precision is exactly our mission today. We are undertaking a tahil amik, a really deep analytical framework dive into the core of Islamic theology, or Kalam, and we're focusing specifically on sifat ilahiyya, the divine attributes.
And our source material here is so crucial because it doesn't just, review the old debates. It actually proposes a highly analytical and, I think, novel classification system.
A new toolkit, almost.
It's exactly that. Think of it as a new toolkit for theological thinkers, and it's designed to achieve absolute clarity. The goal is simple, but it's also incredibly daunting.
Which is?
To safeguard God's absolute transcendence, or tanzih, while still providing really robust intellectual grounds for affirming all of his necessary perfections.
This isn't just, religious instruction for its own sake. This is high-level philosophical work that's aiming for surgical precision in what you believe.
Precisely. And the core conflict that we have to navigate is this philosophical tightrope walk. We have to affirm God's perfect attributes, knowledge, power, life, without falling into the trap of anthropomorphism, which is tashbih.
Making God similar to creation.
Right. But at the same time, we have to avoid the opposite error, negation or tatil.
Which is where you just strip the divine essence of all meaning.
You do. It strips it of all meaningful perfection and turns the concept of God into this empty, undifferentiated void.
So navigating that middle path.
That's it. It requires rigorous analysis. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to even begin this analytical dive, we have to start with the foundational unit. We need a highly precise definition of what a divine attribute, a sifa ilahiyya, even is. Why can't we just say God has characteristics?
Well, because a word like characteristics immediately implies external parts.
Yeah, I see.
And we have to preempt any philosophical error that suggests God is composite or that he acquires things. So our source provides this very heavily guarded definition.
Okay, let's hear it.
Every meaning, monas, subsisting in God's essence, necessitating a specific judgment perfection, or the negation of a defect inseparable from his essence eternally. Azalan wa abadan, and supported by textual proof.
Wow. Okay, that is extremely dense. Let's break that down, starting with the choice of the word meaning, mana. Why is that the cornerstone?
Defining an attribute as a meaning is absolutely crucial. It immediately negates the dangerous idea that an attribute could be, say, a separate substance or some kind of physical thing existing outside the divine essence.
Okay, so if an attribute like power were a separate, physically definable thing,
then you'd be positing two eternal entities. You'd have the divine essence and you'd have the substance of power.
which shatters the whole concept of absolute unity, of Todd.
Fundamentally. So the attribute is a conceptual reality. It's inherent to the essence, not some kind of physical add-on.
So it's not like adding a coat of paint to a substance.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
It's more like, it's like the blueness of blue. It's inherent.
Right.
And then we have to stress the inseparability, as along was abadan, eternally and perpetually. This component is really the second pillar of the definition.
And this emphasizes that the attribute is eternal.
Yes, and it refutes any possibility that an attribute could be, acquired or created or temporary, what they call odith.
I can see the immediate theological necessity here. I mean, if God gained knowledge or power at the moment of creation, that would mean he had a period of deficiency before that.
Exactly. An eternal, unchanging essence must have eternal, unchanging attributes.
The essence has to be pure from change.
Absolutely. And then the third key component is the functional one. The attribute has to necessitate a specific judgment. This is the definition's practical side.
What does that judgment look like in practice?
It means that every attribute affirms a necessary perfection and at the same time negates a corresponding defect.
For example?
For instance, if you affirm the attribute of knowledge, al-ilm, it necessarily means you pass the judgment that God cannot be ignorant. If you affirm life, al-hayat, that necessitates the judgment that God cannot die or, cease to exist, these attributes aren't optional. They are necessary perfections required for God to be the wajib ar-wujud, the necessary existent.
That tight definition really sets the boundaries. Now, the traditional schools of Kalam, they organized all these attributes into, 5 categories to manage all the descriptive language from Scripture?
They did, and that structure is essential context for understanding the new framework we're going to discuss. The traditional Ash'ari classification is a really rigorous attempt to categorize divine perfection, as you find it in the texts.
So we start with the first one, nafsiya, or self-attributes.
Right. That's the most basic category. It contains just one attribute, al-wujud, which is existence.
The foundation.
It's the single foundation upon which all other perfections have to rely.
Wow.
I mean, you can't discuss power or knowledge if existence itself isn't affirmed first.
Okay, and second, and this is conceptually really important, are the salbiya, the negative attributes.
These are the attributes that are defined by negation. They define God by stating what he is not, and by doing so, they establish his transcendence and his perfection.
Give us some examples.
Sure. You have kedem, which is eternity. It negates a beginning. Baka, which is permanence. It negates an end. And muhalafatuhu liladithi, non-similarity to creation.
So these attributes protect that concept of tanzi.
They do, by negating all possible imperfections like change or deficiency or any kind of dependency.
So salbiya define God by what he is not. The next group, the manaweya, they seem to define God by what he is.
Exactly. The manaweya, or the meaning attributes, they're the core set of essential affirmative perfections.
And these are the famous 7.
These are the classic 7. Knowledge, al-ilm, power, al-qudra, will, al-irada, life, al-hayat, and then hearing, sam, sight, banar, and speech, kalam. These are the perfections without which the very concept of the deity is, well, it's impossible.
And we're going to see these manaweya attributes come back later, reclassified as constitutive attributes, because they are just so central to the whole thing.
They really are.
Okay, fourth, we have the philia, or the action attributes. This category deals with the divine acting in time and space.
Right. These are attributes related to God's external relationship with creation. His actions, like creation itself, khalq, sustenance, risk, and giving life or giving death.
Now, the philosophical complication here is that the action itself, like say the creation of a specific tree at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, that action is temporary, it's dieted.
It is.
But the ability to create, that has to be eternal. Otherwise, we violate that principle of inseparability we just talked about.
And that is the critical distinction. The sifa thilia, the action attribute, is eternal in its origin, which is the eternal will and power of God, but it's temporal in its object, the created thing itself.
So that ensures that while God interacts dynamically with the world,
his essence remains eternally pure from any change.
Okay, and finally, we come to the most contentious category, the kabariya, or the reported attributes.
These are the attributes mentioned in Scripture that, on the surface seem to suggest physicality or composition.
Things like the face, al-waj, or the hands, al-yadain, or God being established over the throne, Istawa.
Yes. They are the ones that really force this entire debate on literalism versus interpretation. This traditional structure, it's the map of the intellectual territory we have to cover.
Right. Building on that foundation, we have to be really careful to distinguish between a divine name, an ism, and a divine attribute, a sifa.
We do. While they're obviously related, their theological roles and their linguistic scopes are actually significantly different.
Well, let's start with the name, like Al-Qadir, the powerful, or Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. Why does the source describe the divine name as having this dual role?
Well, a divine name signifies 2 meanings at the same time, the essence and the attribute that subsists within it. So when you invoke Al-Qadir, you're not just invoking power as an abstract concept. You're invoking the essence that is perfectly and absolutely characterized by that power. Its essence plus the perfection.
So the name is this comprehensive signifier of the subject, and it's characteristic. It encompasses the whole thing.
It does, which makes it worthy of invocation. The attribute, on the other hand, has a singular role.
So something like quadra, power, or rama, mercy.
Right. It only denotes the meaning, the perfection, that subsists in the essence, without necessarily encompassing the concept of the essence as a whole, as an absolute name.
So the attribute is conceptually contained within the name.
But the name is not contained within the attribute.
And this conceptual difference, it seems to dictate the rules of derivation. And this is where we see the scope of attributes really broaden out beyond just the formal name.
Precisely. We have two key rules here. First, every name implies a perfect attribute that's universal. From Al-Rabba, the merciful, you derive Al-Rama, mercy.
Simple enough. But the second rule is crucial, and it's a restriction on the names. We can't derive a name from every single attribute or action.
That's right. The scope of formally naming God is extremely restrictive. We affirm actions and consequential attributes like, love, anger, being wrathful, or even employing a subtle strategy, mak. All of these are affirmed in Scripture. But we do not name God Al-Makir, the deceiver, or Al-Gaid, the angry, as these absolute standalone names for perpetual invocation.
What the restriction, though? Why not?
Because a divine name has to imply unreserved, absolute praise in all contexts, for all eternity.
Okay.
And things like wrath or anger or strategic deceit, they are conditional. They're retributive. They're tied to a specific action or reaction to human transgression. They don't represent the absolute unqualified perfection that's required for an ism, a name.
So this is where it gets really interesting, because this confirms that wider scope of the sifa, the attribute.
The conclusion here is that the door of affirming perfections, the scope of attributes, is much wider than the list of formal absolute names, the Asma al-Husna.
So we affirm a richer descriptive theology through these attributes of action.
Even if we restrict the formal list of names that we use in prayer and to define the divine essence. This preserves the qualitative sanctity of the names, but it also ensures the texts can describe a dynamic moral deity who acts in response to justice and mercy.
All right, now we have to address the most difficult part of this whole theological landscape, the mutashabihat, the ambiguous texts. These are the passages that have caused genuine intellectual struggle for millennia because their literal meaning seems to violate that necessary transcendence of the divine.
And this challenge, it forces us to adhere to two non-negotiable points of consensus among all Muslim scholars.
Okay, what are they?
One, the necessity of affirming the explicit non-ambiguous attributes like existence, unity, power. And two, the absolute necessity of tanza, of transcendence. God is absolutely unlike creation. Laisa kamithlihi shay. There is nothing like him.
So when a text mentions God's hand or God being settled upon the throne, the Istawa, the literal reading, a physical hand, a physical sitting, that seems to violate tanzi.
It does. It pushes us toward tashbih, anthropomorphism.
So a methodology is required to manage these texts.
And the first methodological imperative is simply the impossibility of literalism. The literal reading has to be rejected because it leads to anthropomorphism, which is logically impossible for the absolute divine who is non-composite and non-temporal.
And the second imperative follows from that, the necessity of reinterpretation. The apparent rejected meaning has to be redirected. The word they use is arfri, to conform with the core principles of Tawad and Tanzi.
Right, and this redirection leads to the two main historical approaches, Tafwid and Tawad.
Okay, let's start with Tafwid.
Tafwid is the doctrine of agnostic delegation. You affirm the word exactly as it appears in the text, hand, face, whatever it is, but you immediately negate any physical interpretation. You delegate the true, specific, and unique meaning and the modality, the kaifiyya, entirely to God.
So it's a very cautious approach.
Extremely cautious. It's intended to avoid any human assertion about the divine.
And then there's Ta'wil.
Ta'wil is the doctrine of interpretation or figurative reading. Here, after you negate the literal impossibility, the scholar specifies a suitable, non-physical, metaphorical meaning.
So they would argue Istawa must mean conquest or absolute dominance, core.
Exactly. Or that yad, the hand, must mean power, quadra, or blessing, nima.
Wait a minute, though. If the goal is absolute transcendence, isn't Tafwid safer? I mean, if I say God has a hand, but only God knows what it means, I'm not making a human claim about God. But if I say hand means power, I am imposing a human interpretation. Where does the source draw the line to justify Tawil over Tafwid?
That is the central philosophical challenge. And the source's critique of a pure Tafwid is actually very strong. The argument is that absolute delegation risks turning the revelation into obscure symbols. Talasim.
Meaningless puzzles.
Basically. If you're commanded to reflect on the scripture, to do tadabbur, but then you're told that key descriptive words are functionally meaningless to you, well, the act of reflection is completely stalled.
So it risks intellectual stagnation.
It's worse than that. The source argues that pure Tafwid, while it seems safe on the surface, leaves the door wide open for the masses to mentally anthropomorphize these concepts.
Oh, so?
If you affirm the word hand, and you refuse to supply an intellectual substitute for the physical image, what's the inevitable hidden image, the tashbih imni, in the mind of the common person?
It's going to be something physical.
It's still going to be something physical. So the most dedicated textual literalist often ends up being the greatest anthropomorphist in practice, even if they don't realize it.
That makes Tawil a practical necessity, then. Wajib, to protect the core faith of the general populace. It guards the concept of tanzi in the public sphere.
Exactly. The need for clear articulation often overrides the preference for silence. And what's more, even those who claimed pure Tafwid historically often had to engage in necessary tawil to refute heretics, or just to make practical sense of the texts.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If a verse says God is physically with us, even a Hufawe, someone who practices Tafwid, has to interpret that. They have to say it's a presence of knowledge and care, not physical collocation.
Because physical collocation is rationally impossible for the transcendent deity.
Right. So that necessity pushes the scholar, even the cautious one, towards some form of interpretive engagement.
Okay, so moving from the linguistic tools of interpretation to the metaphysical nature of existence itself, we face what is probably the most significant philosophical polemic in all of Kalam.
The eternity of attributes.
The eternity of attributes. If God's attributes, knowledge, power, will, are eternal, and they're distinct from the essence, how do we avoid the charge of positing two or more eternal entities? How do you not compromise absolute unity, Talad?
This is the historical battleground. The moment you affirm eternal attributes subsisting in the essence, you invite that charge of multiplicity in the eternal.
And to avoid this, the Mu'tazila school, they adopted a pretty radical, hyper-transcendentalist position.
They did. They claim that God is knowing, powerful, and living by his essence, and therefore the attributes are identical to the essence alifat and al-dat.
This was their sincere attempt to champion Todd.
It was, they said. God's essence is his knowledge. His essence is his power. But as our source material critiques, this leads to a pretty undeniable logical absurdity.
Which is the collapse of conceptual distinction.
Right.
If essence equals knowledge, and essence also equals power, then knowledge must equal power.
Precisely. If they're all conceptually identical, then the language we use to describe God becomes completely redundant. You've successfully avoided multiplicity, yes, but you've effectively negated the meaning and distinction of the attributes.
Which is a functional tatil.
It is. If you can't differentiate conceptually between God's knowledge and God's power, you've reduced the description of the divine to this undifferentiated block of perfection that just defies any internal analysis.
And analysis is exactly what Scripture demands of us. So the Ash'ari school sought a necessary middle ground to preserve both tawad and the functional meaning of the attributes. And this is where we get that famous and seemingly paradoxical statement. Attributes are neither the essence nor separate from it. La hayan al-dab wa la gairuha.
And this statement is a necessary philosophical assertion. They are not the essence. That's to preserve the distinction between knowledge and power and escape the Mu'tazila trap.
Right.
But they are not separate substances. And that's to avoid the multiplicity of eternals and escape the literalist trap.
But the paradox still remains. I mean, in formal human logic, everything has to be either A or not A. How is this justified?
The justification lies in a crucial metaphysical claim that the logical constraints we apply to creation, to al-wadith, are simply inadequate for the absolute divine, the wajib al-wujud.
So the binary logic of identical or separate is derived from our observation of the finite composite world.
Exactly. We see a hand attached to an arm. They are separate parts of a composite entity.
And applying that same logic to the absolute essence forces us into a false choice.
It does. The Ash'ari position claims that the relationship between the essence and its eternal necessary perfections is utterly unique. It cannot be categorized by human logic that was designed for the finite world. It's a relationship of subsistence. The attributes subsist in the essence, and that's a category beyond the simple binary of identity or separation.
That position is incredibly powerful, but it does rely on accepting that there's a conceptual space outside of human binary logic. And this leads us directly to the conceptual breakthrough of our source material, which tries to define this unique relationship positively rather than negatively.
And this is where our source material provides its most significant contribution.
Hmm.
It introduces the term sifat takwimiyah, or constitutive attributes.
Constitutive attributes.
And this term aims to replace that ambiguous neither and burner with a precise, positive definition of the relationship between the essence and the attribute.
A shift from saying what the attribute isn't to saying what it is in relation to the essence.
Exactly. The conceptual breakthrough is defining the attribute as the essential existential component of the thing's identity. The al-muqawwim al-wujudi.
Okay, I think I understand the word constitutive now. If the attribute is removed, the essence ceases to be the deity.
That's the definition in action. Think of the analogy of a triangle. 3 sides are constitutive of a triangle's identity. If you remove one of those sides, it is conceptually no longer a triangle. Similarly, life, knowledge, power, and will are takwimiyah attributes. They are the inherent determinations that constitute God's unique identity as the absolute deity al-ilah.
So this framework clarifies that these are not some kind of external additions, they're necessary consequences of the essence. But let's return to that classic logical trap. If they are necessary, does that mean God needs them? Does the necessary existent require attributes?
The terminology of need has to be handled very carefully here. Need implies dependence on something outside of the self.
Or a deficiency within the self that needs external completion.
Right, and God is pure from this kind of deficiency. The takwimiyah attributes are not external supplements that God needs to acquire. They are inherent determinations. They are necessary consequences of the fact that He is the necessary existent, the wajib al-wujud.
So the essence determines the attribute. It's an internal, inherent requirement.
Yes, for the concept of the absolute perfect being to hold true.
This constitutive framework is also key for defining the limits of omnipotence, which is a common stumbling block for a lot of students of theology.
It is, since God is defined by absolute perfection through these takwimiyah attributes, His power cannot logically relate to self-contradictions, but are called mutaldati.
Omnipotence means power over all possible things.
Not power over conceptual nullities.
Can we elaborate on that famous example? Can God become human using this framework?
Of course. The question is a logical non-starter, not a limitation on power. Becoming human means turning the absolutely perfect, the essence defined by the takwimiyah, into the deficient.
It means turning the necessary existent into the possible, the eternal into the temporal.
Exactly. So the question is really asking, can God negate the very attributes that constitute His essence?
Which is a self-contradiction. It's asking for a conceptual absurdity, not an action.
Right. The sifat takwimiyah act as rational constraints, and they demonstrate that the scope of omnipotence applies to bringing about all possibilities, not to creating logical impossibilities that would annihilate the definition of the divine essence itself.
Having established the takwimiyah, the attributes that define the essence, we can now move back to the dynamic relationship between God and creation through what the source calls the functional attributes.
Yes, the regulatory and the retributive.
Let's start with the regulatory attributes, the sifat tadbiriyah. These are the manifestations of the essence in the external world, things like creation, sustenance, control.
And these are vital because they counter that philosophical idea that a transcendent deity must be static or, distant. These attributes show that God is actively engaged, a living, willing sovereign.
So they are the necessary action that results from the inherent constitutive perfections.
That's it. The divine action is the outcome of the necessary identity. It's not a new quality that's added on. It's the inevitable output of the eternal qualities.
And the source material provides a kind of formula for this.
It does. Divine action equals the constitutive attributes, life, knowledge, power plus will, Mashiach. God creates because His eternal power is directed by His eternal will, and that is informed by His eternal knowledge.
I really appreciate the Quranic insight that's used to exemplify this. Does He not know who created? And He is the subtle, the all-aware?
It's a profound proof text. It links the external action creation, which is tadbiriyah, directly to the inherent qualities of knowledge, subtlety, and awareness, the takwimiyah.
The action is justified by the knowledge.
The power is guided by the subtlety. This analytical connection maintains the purity of the essence, while still affirming dynamic action in the universe.
Okay, now let's turn to the retributive attributes, the sifat jazaya. These are the terms that often carry the most emotional weight, describing God's response to human moral action: wrath, laughter, love, forgiveness.
These attributes are characterized by a very strict rule. They appear only in contexts of reward or punishment. They act as a conditional response to human action.
So they're never mentioned as unconditional defining qualities like existence or life.
Never. They're always tied to a human condition or action. Like in the examples, they forgot God, so he forgot them, or God mocks them.
And the key rule here, you're saying, is that they employ something called reciprocal contrast.
Takabura dalali, yes. This linguistic function is designed to signify the consequence of an action, not a literal human-like emotion or some psychological state in the divine. God's wrath is not a sudden fit of rage. It is the just execution of punishment, as determined by his eternal justice and will.
Let's focus on that forgetting example. How does the Takomiya framework help us interpret God forgot them?
Well, since we know through the Takomiya that God possesses absolute constitutive knowledge, literal memory loss is impossible.
Right, it's a non-starter.
Therefore, God's forgetting has to be interpreted as the removal of his care or his mercy or his protection. It's a judicial verdict that corresponds exactly to the person's act of forgetting God's commandments. The consequence mirrors the transgression.
So this analytical approach purifies that retributive language and ensures it aligns with the absolute perfection of the essence.
It does. They are actions of justice manifesting from power and will, not human-scale reactions. This classification safeguards the absolute transcendent identity while allowing the text to convey a moral, dynamic relationship between creator and creation.
We return now to those reported attributes, the sifat kabareya, the hand, face, shin, etc. But we're going to use the source's new terminology. Al-mamulat al-lukawiya.
Linguistic predicates.
Linguistic predicates.
And this analytical reframing is essential. Defining them as linguistic predicates emphasizes that these are rhetorical figures used for human comprehension, and they're necessitated by the limits of our own language.
So they're not essential theological attributes defining the essence.
No. They're linguistic approximations of concepts like power or sovereignty or presence.
And this reframing allows the source to launch a pretty powerful critique against that traditional literal affirmation, the Bailakef approach, affirming the word without specifying the modality.
The critique is philosophical. The argument is that affirming a word like hand as a reality in the divine essence, even when you add the caveat, no one knows how, is still problematic. Human language is finite. It's rooted in physical concepts. Affirming the word literally still implies an inherent limitation, or tarid.
Hold on, if the believer refuses to specify the how does it imply a limitation?
Because the word itself is a container of physical limitation. When a human hears the word hand, the inevitable mental image is of an organ, an appendage, something that exists in space and time, even if we intellectually deny the modality of it.
So the highest form of tanza, according to this view, requires extinguishing that mental image entirely.
Yes. It requires insisting all that occurs to your mind, God is different from that. Furthermore, if we affirm the literal word but deny its meaning, we run the risk of just turning the text into a phonetic ritual that's devoid of any comprehensible content.
Which contradicts the mandate for contemplation.
Exactly. Why does God use a word if we must immediately declare it functionally meaningless to us? The source argues that the communicative function of the Quran demands that these predicates convey a coherent, non-physical meaning, like power or blessing.
This is the moment for clarification then. If all words, knowledge, power, hand are human language, why are knowledge and power acceptable as Takomiya attributes, while hand and face are relegated to mere linguistic predicates?
The distinction is both ontological and conceptual, and it's really the key insight of the framework.
Okay.
Knowledge, power, life, and will are abstract concepts of absolute perfection. They can be conceived of without any physical instrumentality. God hears without an ear. God knows without a brain. Their conceptual essence is pure abstract perfection.
But hand, face, shin, the linguistic predicates, they are intrinsically physically linked to organs and forms in our language.
Precisely. They carry the unavoidable baggage of composition and spatial limitation. So to affirm a word like yad, hand, as a reality in the divine essence without specifying the meaning as power or bounty is to risk applying physical boundaries to the infinite. The constitutive attributes transcend human instrumentality, while the linguistic predicates are defined by human instrumentality, which demands interpretation to save transcendence.
Now we get to apply this rigorous framework. We can use the principles of Tanza, Takwamia, and linguistic predicates to deconstruct some of the most complex, ambiguous concepts in the Quran. Let's begin with Maya, or companionship.
Right. Maya appears in verses like, "He is with you wherever you are." If you take that literally, a physical co-presence, it suggests that the absolute divine is contained by space, that he's fused with creation.
It clearly violates Tanzi.
It does. So the Takwindia attributes of necessity and transcendence force a reinterpretation immediately. We have to look at the context. That verse is immediately followed by, God is seeing of what you do. And other texts pair Maya with, I hear and I see. So the analysis concludes that this is a companionship of knowledge, hearing, sight, support, and protection.
Not physical location.
Never physical location.
Yeah.
God's knowledge and power encompass us. His essence is absolutely transcendent and pre-existent to space itself.
Okay, next, the pair that sparks endless debates. Istawa, establishment or ascension, and al-arsh, the throne. If we reject the physical sitting, what's the required analytical interpretation?
The source performs a really rigorous linguistic talil amik of the word istawa. It shows that the word consistently means completion of purpose, mastery, control, and governance. Tamam al-qast wal tadbir.
Okay.
And crucially, the verse, then he established himself over the throne, is always immediately followed by a functional action of governance, something like managing the affair.
So the linguistic structure itself links the word not to physical movement or location, but to the function of command and sovereignty.
Exactly. Istiwa is an attribute of sovereignty, a sifa tadbiriya, a regulatory attribute, not a physical description of the essence.
And what about the throne, al-arsh?
The throne is analyzed not as a physical chair, which the source just dismisses as a literalist anthropomorphic reading, but as the locus of absolute sovereignty, universal governance, and divine providence. Its mention is symbolic.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The text mentioning the throne was upon the water at the beginning of creation. It says, his throne was upon the water so that he may test you. That symbolizes God's care, his preparation, his established authority over the nascent biological world, and it immediately shifts the focus from physical creation to moral testing and accountability.
So it's the center of cosmic decree and authority.
That's it.
Let's move to a concept that's related to movement, but which the source argues is actually about existential status. Hubu, descent, or falling.
Hubu is often mistakenly interpreted as just simple physical movement downward. But the analytical framework shows it consistently denotes a change in existential rank or status. In the Darfil Rutba. It's not just physical movement.
Can you use the example of Adam and Eve to explain that?
Of course. When Adam and Eve were told to make hubu from the garden, it was a descent from a status of absolute purity, of immediate provision and perpetual care, into the world of struggle, hardship, and moral responsibility.
The ranks changed.
The rank changed from perpetually cared for to perpetually tested.
And this pattern has to hold for other uses of the word, like with Noah.
It does. Noah's hubu from the ark was a transition from a state of absolute divine protection sealed off from the world chaos to the world of construction, agriculture, and toil.
God.
And similarly, the children of Israel's hubud to a city after they complained about the manna and quail was an abandonment of prophetic, miraculous provision for the hardship and complexity of the normal world. It means leaving the realm of care for the realm of responsibility.
That significantly enriches the word's meaning and confirms the importance of contextual analysis over just a literal reading. Now, for the most controversial linguistic predicate, al-sak, the shin.
This comes from the verse. The sak wraps around the sak on that day. The drive is to your Lord. Literalists took sak to mean the physical shin, but the source argues through deep linguistic analysis that the word sak, which is related to saka, to drive or to gather, here refers to the groups being driven. Al-Yifa al-Musaka.
The driven group, not the body part.
Yes. The phrase means that the groups being driven toward judgment, the believers and the disbelievers, they intertwine and they join together toward their final destination. Their destiny is sealed together as they head toward their Lord.
And that interpretation aligns perfectly with the next phrase, the drive is to your Lord on that day.
It does, and it completely eliminates the need for any physical attribute, upholding Tanza through pure linguistic rigor.
Finally, let's distinguish between two verbs of movement, which are crucial for interpreting prophetic traditions about God's appearance. Nuzul, descending, versus marji or ityan, coming or appearing.
The Quranic usage shows a very clear pattern here. Nuzul is reserved for non-essential things coming from God orders, angels, books. It relates to God's inherent al-ulu, his transcendence, and his communication with the world.
Okay.
Maji, or ityan, which means coming or appearing, as in, and your Lord comes, and the angel, rank upon rank. That is reserved for the manifestation of judgment, authority, or power. It is never used for physical movement of the essence.
So the Quran reserves different verbs for the essence versus for the effects.
Exactly. And this strong linguistic pattern challenges any interpretation of a tradition like the famous one about God's nuzul to the lower heaven that suggests physical transfer. It implies that such language, if it's affirmed, must be understood as an arrival of the effect of mercy or grace or a heightened answer to prayer, and not a physical repositioning of the essence itself.
So the analysis concludes that the manifestation of judgment, the maje, is a function of the constitutive attributes.
Power, justice, will, and not an attribute of spatial location.
This deep dive has shown the immense intellectual rigor that's required to maintain the foundational tenets of theology. We've navigated the dense landscape of the Kalam debates, moving beyond ambiguity to the necessity of intellectual precision that's inherent in this Taqumiyya framework.
We've really highlighted the delicate and necessary balance between affirming God's absolute perfection and at the same time safeguarding his absolute transcendence. By classifying attributes based on their conceptual function, constitutive, regulatory, retributive, and linguistic predicates, we gain intellectual clarity and we protect ourselves against both the dangers of literalism and the negation of meaning.
The power of this analytical rigor is so evident in how we deconstructed those ambiguous terms. Understanding Istawa's mastery, Hubu as a change in existential rank, and the Sak as the driven groups, it not only maintains doctrinal purity, but it unlocks these profound layers of meaning within the sacred texts.
The entire analytical framework really demonstrates that the divine text itself operates with a profound linguistic and structural discipline, and that demands that we as readers meet that level of intellectual effort.
So the final provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. If the Quran uses such meticulous linguistic and philosophical discipline to prevent error, and it specifically urges you to reflect, to do tadabbur with analytical depth, what obligation does that place on your reading of the text? Consider how the framework of constitutive attributes shifts your understanding of God's essence, and explore the sources further to see the full implications of this Ta'lil Amik.
And maybe go explore how applying the concept of hubu, that descent from pure care to the world of responsibility, changes the way you approach your own challenges and tests in life.
Join us again soon for another deep dive.